Hello, my name is Rachel Bonner, and I'm a PhD student in the History of Art and Visual Culture Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz. I received the Richard E. Greenleaf Visiting Library Scholar Award for 2021, and I was excited to be able to spend 2 weeks in October in Albuquerque at the University of New Mexico Center for Southwest Research, where I worked on a project that is currently entitled Traversing the Land of Enchantment, Space, Time, and Movement at U.S. Heritage Sites along the Camino de Tierra Adentro. I would like to thank the University of New Mexico Libraries and the Latin American and Iberian Institute for this opportunity. The staff at the Center for Southwest Research have been particularly helpful, and I would like to thank them for their time and expertise. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, my trip to Albuquerque was the first that I've been able to undertake as I embark on my dissertation, and this trip has provided me with a wonderful foundation for ongoing research and interpretive work. I will begin by providing some background on my topic, a historic trade route from Mexico City to what is now northern New Mexico, known as the Camino de Tierra Adentro. I will also gesture towards some of the theoretical considerations that guide this project, and that have informed my methodology in the archive at the Center for Southwest Research. Finally, I will discuss a few of the visits that I was able to make to local sites associated with the Camino Real in Albuquerque, Corrales, and Santa Fe, and touch on the impact that my time in New Mexico has had on my evolving dissertation direction. While often referred to as a single road, the Camino de Tierra Adentro, sometimes translated as the Royal Road of the Interior, is actually a series of historic trade routes. The northernmost regions have also historically at times been referred to as the Chihuahua Trail. These routes along the Rio Grande link Mexico City with what is now the U.S. Southwest, but was once the northern frontier of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. While many sources consider the Santa Fe Plaza to be the northern terminus of the route, others indicate that trails extended as far north as Taos. The trails connected these regions with Mesoamerica prior to the Spanish conquest, and served as the routes through which settlers and trade items arrived in the area prior to U.S. territorial expansion. The region now known as the State of New Mexico is home to the greatest number of UNESCO World Heritage Sites in the United States. The state gained a new series of sites in October of 2000 when the U.S. government recognized the northernmost portions of the historic El Camino de Tierra Adentro as U.S. heritage. These sites, which conceptually link locations across roughly 404 miles of land in what is today New Mexico and Texas, are cooperatively managed by 4 state and federal agencies and are the focus of my ongoing research. My methodology is influenced by the interdisciplinary field of critical heritage studies. Here you can see just a few of the texts that have sparked my interest in the Camino de Tierra Adentro. Richard Grusin's Culture, Technology, and the Creation of America's National Parks looks at how national parks, while often approached as simple acts of environmental preservation, have contributed to politically expedient articulations of national identity. In California Mission Landscapes, Race, Memory, and the Politics of Heritage, Elizabeth Crider-Reed examines the restoration of Spanish colonial missions along California's constructed Camino Real, and pays particular attention to the way that anachronistic Mediterranean garden spaces function at the restored mission sites. Crider-Reed argues that these redesigned spaces nostalgically obscure the colonial realities of the sites, while naturalizing and rearticulating notions of white European dominance over the landscape. Rodney Harrison is a prolific writer in the field of heritage studies, and in heritage critical approaches, he helpfully frames the identification, or you could say creation, and conservation of heritage as the political act. Like the concept of history, heritage is inherently future-oriented and is often articulated in response to a sense of anxiety or vulnerability precipitated by change. While heritage is not necessarily always reactionary, scholars such as Harrison argue that it can nevertheless reveal a range of social tensions and negotiations. This is not the only work focused on the relationship between land, social values, and the articulation of identity to influence my research. I am also intrigued by the parallel between sites along the Camino Real and Catholic pilgrimage routes, and am inspired by scholars like Cody Musselman, who researches the ways in which the creation of vernacular and secular shrines in Aspen, Colorado, constitute what she terms a, quote, space marking practice, end quote. My goal for this research trip was to look at both textual and visual images of the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, in order to get a sense of how and when the trail is invoked. After the arrival of the railroad to New Mexico in the late 19th century, the trail diminished in importance as a trade route and seems to have faded from public discourse until the last decades of the 20th century. As a scholar of visual culture, I am interested in analyzing both text and images to examine the ways that these sites treat themes of movement, conceptualized in terms of both time and space. Paradoxically, El Camino Real seems to signify connection, mobility, and exchange at the same time that it evokes a romanticized notion of pre-railroad stasis. In many ways, the route appears to serve as a synecdoche for the larger region, to which the ideologically potent adjective isolated has often been applied. So my research to date is guided by a series of questions. What does it mean to turn a small portion of a roughly 1,600-mile transnational trade route into a series of national heritage sites? In what specific ways do sites along the Camino Real naturalize or present or foreclose an opportunity to challenge contemporary border politics? When the National Park Service's website proclaims that visitors to sites along the route can, quote, stand where they, the early settlers, stood and see a landscape virtually unchanged, end quote, I am reminded of the ways that tourists have revitalized settler colonial narratives of progress by, quote, tracing the footsteps of the Padres from mission to mission in Alta California. So other questions that I ask in this research include, in what ways is the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, with its particular legacy of motion and exchange, inscribed onto a, quote, unchanging landscape? How might heritage sites simultaneously link and sever the land in what has become the United States from the regions that constitute Mexico? In beginning to explore these questions, I was fortunate to encounter an excellent collection of primary and secondary materials related to the Camino Real at the Center for Southwest Research. I had a chance to look for verbal and visual descriptions of the trail in both the Eleanor B. Adams and the Francis V. Scholes papers. And the fact that this route tended to be more of a peripheral subject for these prominent scholars of regional history working in the mid-20th century provides valuable context for my research. The Camino Real de Tierra Adentro did, however, come up in these papers. Here you see an example from Box 1, Folder 13 of the Scholes papers, where the scholar mentions that the historic route is overlooked and even suggests that it should be considered more important than the Santa Fe Trail, which connected New Mexico with the United States via Missouri. This typewritten note is actually in part of Scholes' archive devoted to research about confrontations between settlers and indigenous inhabitants of the region. So while earlier scholars did acknowledge the trail, the records seem to suggest a lack of general public knowledge and enthusiasm. In many ways, Scholes' papers serve as both a primary and secondary source, as I'm interested in his insights as well as in his and archivist organizational methods and what they might reveal about different priorities and the connections that the scholar made. My time in the archive has revealed an increase in interest in all things Camino Real in the final decades of the 20th century, when the route's antiquity seems to have often been invoked in contrast to northeastern sites associated with British colonialism, such as Plymouth Rock. Here also there is a parallel with California, where the mission sites were often invoked in similar ways by regional boosters. A growing interest in the route can also be contextualized by, among other things, the contentious 1992 quincentenary of Columbus's expedition to the Western Hemisphere, and the 1993 North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. Here you see one of the earliest newspaper articles in the archive focused on the preservation of the trail, published in the Albuquerque Journal. Notice the inset map of the route along the Rio Grande that includes the figure of a solitary conquistador. This is from March of 1989. Along with newspapers, I was also able to look through the Works Progress Administration records during my time in the archive. These documents provided an excellent example of what was considered the most culturally significant and worthy of preservation at the time that they were commissioned, in the wake of the Great Depression and not too long after New Mexican statehood. While I read some fascinating local stories in these files, I made note of the fact that the Camino Real does not seem to have been a strong focus of local or national identity at that time, or at least was not the focus of U.S. government employees tasked with collecting regional knowledge, culture, and lore. When the archive was closed, I had a chance to travel north to Santa Fe in order to see the Palace of the Governors and to visit the New Mexico History Museum. And here you see the facade of the Palace of the Governors, which houses the History Museum. I was also able to take a guided tour of Casa San Ysidro, a historic home in Corrales that functions as a satellite site for the Albuquerque Museum of Art. As you can see by this sign to the left, Casa San Ysidro is formally affiliated with the Camino Real. The photograph to the right is of the interior courtyard of the House Museum, and right off of this walkway to the right is a Catholic chapel that was constructed by the site's last owners, a Protestant couple from the Midwest who renovated the home and turned it into a historic site. Unfortunately, some of the collections had recently been moved for conservation reasons. There had been some flooding in the area, but here in the middle you can see an example of the type of material culture on display at the site, including boltos or carved wooden figures in the round, tin work, wooden furniture, and Pueblo ceramic work. The sheer number of sites and the amount of eclectic visual and material culture associated with the Camino Real through these sites is dizzying. One of my goals during my time in New Mexico was to narrow my research focus and to find a more manageable angle from which to approach this subject matter. In the archives, I came across a large quantity of material devoted to one particular site that seems to encapsulate some of the recent interest in this history. This site is a state monument called El Camino Real International Heritage Center. And here you see an image of that site. So El Camino Real International Heritage Center is located on a 125-acre property in south central New Mexico between Socorro and Truth or Consequences. It was established in 2005 and it has actually been closed to the public since 2016. As you can see, the 20,000 square foot Heritage Center was designed to resemble a ship moving along the trail. And here there's of course a reference to both caravans and to Atlantic voyages. Here you see a newspaper article from 2005 when the museum opened, published in the Albuquerque Journal. And I like this image because it shows two people standing on the east-facing facade and surveying the landscape, illustrating the way that visitors would interact with the architecture and the way that architecture can mediate other interactions. And to the right is just a closer view of the two figures. The construction of El Camino Real International Heritage Center was directed by the Museum of New Mexico's State Monuments Division and the United States Bureau of Land Management, and the site included a series of flags from the United States, Mexico, and Spain, as well as the state flags of New Mexico and Texas. I was fascinated by the organization of space at this site and by the particular narrative that it enacted for visitors, many of whom seem to have been locals with roots in the area. The layout of the exhibition space encouraged visitors to ascend a gentle ramp as they moved chronologically through time while traversing a shortened version of the trail. The model trail began in a recreation of the plaza at Zacatecas, the birthplace of the conquistador Juan de Oñate, and concluded in the plaza at Santa Fe with a replica of the Palace of the Governors. And I want to mention that while I do not have photographs of the interior of this exhibition space, they can be found online at CaminoRealHeritage.org, a site maintained by an organization called the Friends of El Camino Real Historic Trail. And this photograph to the right just really shows the mast-like construction of the building. While in the archives, I was able to access a CD with some high-quality photographs of the architecture of the Heritage Center, along with photographs of some of the objects that were on display there. Here you see a few of these objects. So they included boltos, such as the one on the screen to the right, weaponry, spurs, and other riding equipment, and decorative storage chests. And my understanding is that after the Heritage Center closed to the public in 2016, these objects were redistributed to other sites associated with the Camino Real, such as house museums. So it was extremely helpful to see images of some of the material culture that was on display there, and that was the focus of documentation efforts. So on this slide, you see an image of a brochure preserved in the archive, and I want to draw your attention to the black and yellow images of a conquistador and an indigenous rider in profile. And at the top is a photograph of someone on horseback that sort of echoes these drawings compositionally, creating a sense of continuity and arguably of progression, as well as a sense of separation. And this also reminds me to mention that there was a proposal to include equestrian and hiking trails throughout the land surrounding the Heritage Center. This is yet another way in which the site was compellingly participatory. I also want to show a close-up of these two parallel images of the route at the bottom of the left side of the brochure. The one to the left shows tracks in the grass, and the other shows Interstate 25, which runs along the historic trail at night. So not only is the viewer positioned as though they are traveling along the route, in a way that kind of recalls the conquistador figure on the inset map of the 1989 newspaper article that I showed earlier in this presentation. But there is an aesthetic achieved through physically marking the land in both, while the parallel images contribute to and naturalize a balanced effect of progress and continuity. So one thing that interests me here, connecting back to the idea of pilgrimage that I mentioned earlier, is the movement of visitors, who are not only encouraged to physically ascend as they retrace the trail through the chronological and south-north exhibition layout, but who are also positioned on board this abstracted modernist ship with an expansive and even bird's-eye view of the surrounding land. I mentioned that the site was located in a more rural part of south-central New Mexico, and this site was chosen according to email records in the archive to facilitate business interests, private business interests. But it was also championed for its view of the most infamous and perilous portion of the journey for early settlers traveling along the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro. The grounds of the site itself, right around the building, were planted with desert gardens. And I was interested to see that these were not the only site-specific additions. While in the archive, I came across some documents that referenced contemporary art that was commissioned specifically for the Heritage Center, and I'm interested in possibly structuring my dissertation around this work, which I've just begun to explore, and the ways in which it fits into the larger narratives being enacted at the site. As I continue to develop these ideas, I hope to visit other sites associated with the Camino Real de Tierra Adentro in New Mexico, as well as in Texas and Mexico. I look forward to building on this valuable archival experience at the University of New Mexico, and want to conclude by thanking the university once again for its support.